History is not just carved in stone or written on parchment, it is etched into the minds of those who learn it. And behind every great civilization, behind every era of enlightenment, there were teachers, the unsung architects of human destiny. They took the raw, untamed energy of young minds, those live wires of potential, and grounded them in wisdom. But who were these figures of the ancient world? How did they shape empires, philosophies, and revolutions? Long before classrooms, before textbooks, even before the written word was perfected, there were the scribes of Mesopotamia. Picture this: the dusty streets of Ur, 2500 BCE. A young apprentice kneels before a clay tablet, his stylus trembling under the watchful eye of his master. Every wedge-shaped cuneiform stroke carries the weight of law, of trade, of history itself. These were not mere instructors, they were gatekeepers of civilization. A single mistake in recording a king's decree could mean ruin. The scribe's duty? To take the wild, restless minds of youth and discipline them into precision, to turn chaos into order. And yet, their reward was not gold or glory. It was the silent satisfaction of knowledge preserved. For without them, the Code of Hammurabi would have been lost, the Epic of Gilgamesh forgotten. They were the first to understand. A teacher's true legacy is not in monuments, but in minds. Fast forward 1,000 years to the sun-drenched Agora of Athens. Here, among the marble columns, walked a man who would redefine teaching forever: Socrates. He did not lecture, he did not dictate. Instead, he wandered, he questioned, he provoked. Imagine being one of his students, your every belief challenged, your assumptions unraveled. The unexamined life is not worth living, he declared. His method? To take those live wires, the restless, brilliant youth of Athens, and ground them not in answers, but in deeper questions. And for this, he paid the ultimate price. Condemned to drink hemlock, accused of corrupting the youth. But his legacy? Unshakable. For he proved that a teacher's greatest power lies not in controlling thought, but in freeing it. But teaching was not confined to the grand academies of Greece. Along the Silk Road, in the shadow of the Himalayas, Buddhist monks sat cross-legged in cave monasteries, passing down sutras word by word, breath by breath. In China, Confucian scholars taught that harmony began in the classroom, that to educate a single child was to shape an empire. These were the quiet custodians of civilization, threading knowledge across continents like pearls on a string. Their classrooms had no walls, their lessons no end, and so, across deserts and mountains, the live wires of humanity were grounded, not in uniformity, but in understanding. But what happened when these teachings clashed with power? When empires rose and fell on the words of a single mentor? The story is far from over. Knowledge has always been dangerous, and those who dared to teach it even more so, because when empires rise, the first thing they seek to control is not land, not gold, but thought. Yet, across history, there were those who refused to let the flame of learning die, even if it cost them everything. It began with fire. In 48 BCE, the greatest repository of human understanding, the Library of Alexandria, burned. Some say it was Caesar's war, others blame religious purges. But the truth? The library was a threat, because knowledge is power, and power unsettles tyrants. Yet, in the smoke and ash, the scholars did not flee. They fought back. They smuggled scrolls into hidden caves, whispered theories in back alleys, taught in secret under the cover of night. They knew, if the written word survived, so would civilization. We may never know how much was lost that day, but because of these defiant teachers, fragments survived. Euclid's geometry, Hipparchus's astronomy, the plays of Sophocles, scattered like embers, waiting to reignite the world. 4 centuries later, another fire burned, this time for a woman, Hypatia of Alexandria, mathematician, astronomer, the last great teacher of the ancient world. She walked the streets in philosophers' robes, her lectures drawing crowds. But in an empire fracturing between faith and reason, her voice was too dangerous. Then came the day a mob dragged her from her chariot. They did not just kill her, they erased her, scraping her flesh with oyster shells, burning her writings. A warning: some truths are too dangerous to teach. Yet even in silence, her defiance echoed. Because to kill a teacher is not to kill an idea, it is to immortalize it. As Rome fell, Europe plunged into darkness. But in remote monasteries, quills still scratched against parchment. Irish monks huddled in stone towers, copying Cicero and Plato while Vikings raided their shores. In Baghdad, House of Wisdom scholars preserved Aristotle Aristotle as war raged outside. Why risk their lives for old words? Because they knew, without teachers, there are no students. Without students, history forgets itself. These were not just scribes. They were smugglers, spiriting knowledge through the centuries like a torch through a storm. But the greatest test was yet to come, when an entire empire would rise on the backs of thinkers, only to turn on them when their lessons grew too bold. There comes a moment in history when the old world cracks, when the weight of what is known becomes too heavy for the minds that carry it. And in those fissures, the future spills through. This is the story of the Renaissance, not just of art and beauty, but of war. A silent war, fought in candlelit studies and hidden lecture halls, where the most dangerous weapon was not a sword, but a thought. In the 14th century, the church ruled knowledge. To question Aristotle, heresy. To dissect a corpse, sacrilege. Yet in Padua, Bologna, and Paris, students gathered in secret, not in grand cathedrals of learning, but in back rooms, taverns, even graveyards. Here, they did the unthinkable. They opened the human body. They charted the stars not to praise God, but to understand Him. And with every forbidden lesson, they chipped away at 1,000 years of doctrine. The punishment for such curiosity, excommunication, torture, death, yet still, they came, because some questions burned too brightly to be buried. Then came a man who would force the world to choose between faith and fact. Galileo Galilei didn't just teach the stars, he proved they didn't revolve around Earth. And when the Inquisition pressed a telescope into his hands and demanded he recant, he faced a decision: lie or lose everything. Legend says that after his confession, as he rose from his knees, he whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. They silenced him. But his students? They smuggled his notes out of Italy. By the time the church lifted his ban, the world had already moved on, without its permission. Yet one invention would make censorship impossible: Gutenberg's press. Now, ideas could spread faster than any heresy hunt. Martin Luther nailed his theses to a door, but it was the printers who turned protest into revolution, mass-producing pamphlets like bullets for the mind. For the first time, a peasant could own a book. A woman could read philosophy. Knowledge was no longer a privilege, it was a contagion. And so, the live wires of Europe sparked a fire that would burn down thrones. But the old powers would not fall quietly, and when the guillotine blades rose in Paris, it would be the students, the taught, who decided which heads would roll. 1789. The streets of Paris ran with ink before they ran with blood, because revolutions don't begin with swords, they begin with words. And who controls the words? The teachers. This was the Enlightenment's deadly legacy. Not just new ideas, but the radical belief that every butcher's son, every merchant's daughter had the right to learn them, and that belief would shatter kingdoms. As the revolution erupted, a new breed of teacher emerged from the chaos. These were no dusty scholars. They were radicals, armed with primers and pistols. In abandoned churches and repurposed palaces, they taught the masses to read not just scripture, but sedition. Their textbook, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, their blackboards, the walls of Paris, scrawled with manifestos. Their mission? To ensure that once the people learned their power, they could never unlearn it. The crown had banned education for the poor for centuries. Now, the poor would decide the crown's fate, but not all lessons ended in triumph. When the revolutionary government took orphans from the streets to mold into new citizens, their education came with muskets. Boys as young as 12 debated Plato by day and guarded guillotines by night. The most famous? Joseph Barra, a 13-year-old drummer boy killed by royalists. His legend was weaponized. His dying words, "Vive la République," painted in every classroom. A sobering truth: even the noblest ideals can turn children into propaganda. The revolution proved education could topple kings. But who would control what came next? As the 19th century dawned, the powerful struck back. In England's factory towns, industrialists funded schools, not to liberate, but to discipline. The Lancaster method turned classrooms into assembly lines, hundreds of children chanting times tables in unison, monitored by child monitors. Why? An educated worker could read Marx. A controlled worker kept the machines running. The battle lines were drawn. Was education meant to ignite minds or pacify them? And then came the century that would decide the answer, when teachers would be exiled, executed, and celebrated, not for what they taught, but for who they dared to teach. The 20th century began with a lie. The lie was this: that that some minds were born to rule and others to be ruled, that certain truths were too dangerous to teach, and so the greatest war in history would not be fought over land or gold, but over the right to think. Berlin, 1933. Flames swallowed Einstein's theories, Freud's studies of the mind, Hemingway's stories. The Nazis knew, to control a people, you must first unteach them. But in hidden basements, professors held secret seminars, passing single copies of banned books hand to hand like contraband. And in Warsaw's ghettos, teachers conducted lessons in attics as tanks rolled below. When asked why they risked it, one wrote in her diary, "If we cannot save their bodies, we will save their minds." But the 20th century invented a new horror, not just forbidding education, but weaponizing it. In Stalin's gulags, prisoners were forced to confess their ideological crimes, then teach others to do the same. In Mao's China, children denounced their own parents for incorrect thoughts. Yet even here, resistance hid in plain sight. A gulag prisoner scratched equations into frozen mud. A Cambodian teacher under the Khmer Rouge secretly recited poetry disguised as folk songs. Because the human mind, once truly awakened, cannot be untaught. Then came the battle that would redefine teaching forever. Mississippi, 1964. Freedom schools opened in abandoned shacks, teaching black children their stolen history. The teachers? Often college students from the North, many barely older than their pupils. The price? Burned churches, disappearances, murders. But when 8-year-old Ruby Bridges walked into an all-white school flanked by federal marshals, her teacher, Barbara Henry, taught only her for a year. In an empty classroom, every lesson was an act of defiance, every word a revolution. And so we arrive at today. The live wires still spark in Ukrainian bunkers with online lessons, in Afghan girls' secret schools, in banned history books passed under desks. The pattern is clear. Every tyrant first targets the teachers, because to teach is to arm the future. So tell me, what will you teach? If you followed this journey from ancient scribes to modern rebels, you understand. History's greatest teachers were never just instructors. They were conspirators against ignorance. Want to join the conspiracy? Subscribe for more untold stories.